Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take on that stack of sources you've provided, those complex doctrines, the dense historical moments, and, yeah, the challenging scriptural claims, and we really try to extract the absolute core of what you need to know.
And today, wow, we are wading into what many consider, really the most crucial and maybe controversial origin point in foundational theology. The story of Abraham's plural marriage.
Specifically, his relationship with Hagar.
Exactly, Hagar. And how that narrative, that specific story, has been so central to justifying Doctrine Covenants 132 and, well, the entire institution of Mormon plural marriage.
So our mission today, our goal for this deep dive, is to gain knowledge quickly but really thoroughly, right? Without getting totally overwhelmed by conflicting information.
Which is easy to do on this topic.
Oh, absolutely. So to do that, we have to perform a rigorous comparison. We're laying the modern scriptural claims like D&C 132 right alongside the original biblical narrative in Genesis.
Side by side.
We want to uncover exactly where the ethical, historical, and maybe theological contradictions pop up.
And this deep dive is just essential because, look, when you examine the defense of plural marriage, Abraham's story is always there. It's framed repeatedly as the foundational claim, isn't it?
It really is. The bedrock.
It's the cornerstone. The whole doctrine of celestial plural marriage seems to rest on it. So we need to know, does the Genesis account, if you read it objectively, with fresh eyes, does it actually support that assertion made later in D&C 132 that God commanded Abraham to take multiple wives?
That's the entire weight of this conversation right there. Because when a narrative gets used over and over to justify something contentious...
Yeah, details get fuzzy.
Exactly. Details get sanitized or maybe twisted a little. So we are committed today to looking past the doctrinal defense, the justifications, and focusing on the deep, messy, and frankly painful emotional experience of every single character involved.
Abraham, Sarai, who becomes Sarah, of course, and Hagar. Especially Hagar.
Yes, because often that emotional toll, the human story recorded right there in the scripture, it tells a very different story than the later legalistic justification.
It really does. The subtext is powerful.
Okay, section 1 then. Let's unpack this core issue right away. The commandment contradiction. Genesis versus D&C 132.
Right. And the source material we're looking at presents an argument that's, well, it's hard to ignore because it's based purely on reading the text.
What does it say?
It argues there is simply no verifiable scriptural support in the Bible for the claim that God commanded Abraham to take Hagar as a wife.
No command in Genesis.
None recorded, which means the assertion in D&C 132 is seen, depending on your view, either as maybe an unrecorded revelation, something that happened off-page, or, as the analysis suggests, potentially a fabrication, something created later to fit a need.
Okay, so let's go to the source, Genesis 16. If you approach that chapter without the D&C 132 lens already in place.
Yeah, if you just read Genesis 16 cold.
What does it say about where the idea came from?
It's startlingly clear. The narrative explicitly states it does not come from a divine directive.
Not from God.
No, it comes directly from Sarai.
Sarai, Abraham's wife.
Yes. And this is so crucial because it immediately roots the practice, the specific instance of it, in human desperation, in cultural tradition maybe, and individual agency, not in some grand, divine, eternal decree from God.
And Sarai's motivation is absolutely vital here, isn't it? She wasn't just, casually suggesting this.
No, not at all. The scriptures remind us, Genesis 11.30 is explicit, she was barren.
And they'd been waiting a long time.
A decade in Canaan, watching her husband Abram receive these absolutely spectacular promises of posterity directly from God. Genesis 12, 13, 15, promise after promise.
Your seed will be like the stars, like the dust of the earth.
Incredible promises, yet the promise remained unfulfilled through her, the covenant wife.
You have to imagine the emotional landscape.
Yeah,
here.
absolutely. 10 years of hope, 10 years of hearing God promise your husband this immense posterity, and slowly realizing you might be the obstacle.
And the cultural context back then.
It just amplifies the pressure massively. In the ancient Near East, posterity wasn't just nice to have, it was everything. Status, security, legacy, and barrenness. It was seen as a curse, a spiritual and social disaster.
So Sarai's action, her suggestion.
It was a desperate attempt, really. Culturally sanctioned, yes, but desperate. Trying to fulfill what she saw as a divine promise through human means, using the legal tools available at the time.
In this mechanism, using a handmaid or a slave as a surrogate, that wasn't unique to them, was it?
No, not at all. We see similar arrangements described in things like the Nusi documents, other ancient legal codes from that region and era. If the primary wife couldn't produce an heir, she sometimes had the right or even the obligation to provide a slave woman to her husband for that purpose.
Okay, so Sarai suggests it based on her desperation and the culture. How does Abram react? What does Genesis say?
Genesis 16, verse 2. It's unambiguous. It says, Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai.
Hearken to the voices of Sarai. What's the significance of that specific phrasing?
That phrasing, hearken to the voice, is typically used in Scripture when someone is responding to human counsel or an appeal from another person. It's not the language usually used for obeying a direct command from Jehovah.
So if God had commanded it,
The text would likely say something much more direct, like, and the Lord commanded Abram, saying, take Hagar to wife, and Abram obeyed. But that kind of formula, it's conspicuously absent here.
okay, so the biblical record seems pretty clear. Sarai had the idea, Abram listened to her.
That's the plain reading of Genesis 16.
But this is where the contradiction just leaps out when we pivot to D&C 132.
Yeah.
How does that later revelation frame this same event?
It completely overrides the biblical history, or at least appears to. D&C 132, verse 34, is presented as God speaking directly, looking back at this event and specifically claiming divine authority for the act.
What's the wording?
Verily I say unto you, nay, for I, the Lord, commanded it.
Wow! I, the Lord, commanded it.
Yes, this is God, in the voice of the revelation, directly correcting any implication that Abraham acted solely on his own initiative or just on Sarai's suggestion. It's a retrospective divine command.
That reliance on a later revelation to essentially rewrite or maybe reinterpret a foundational historical event, that introduces profound textual instability, doesn't it?
It really does. Because now you, the reader, you're forced to accept one of two things. Either the explicit text of Genesis 16 is inaccurate, or maybe just incomplete, or that the revelation recorded in D&C 132 is incorrect about the historical source of the command regarding Hagar.
You just can't easily reconcile Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai with I, the Lord, commanded it without creating a pretty significant foundational contradiction.
They seem diametrically opposed on the surface. Now, common defense offered by those trying to reconcile the two texts.
Yes, how do people bridge this gap?
They often suggest that Sarai acted based on a prior but unrecorded divine command given to Abraham.
Ah, so God told Abraham earlier, maybe he hesitated.
Exactly. The idea is God told Abraham, you need to take a plural wife to fulfill the posterity promise. Abraham perhaps hesitated or delayed, and Sarai, maybe knowing about this command or just sensing a need, finally pushed him to implement it. She took the initiative to fulfill God's will.
Okay, that's a possible harmonization. But what happens when we look at the subsequent actions in Genesis? Does that theory hold up?
Well, that's where it gets tricky again. If Abraham was following a prior divine command, why does the text specifically frame his response as, hearken to the voice of Sarai? Why wouldn't it say something like, and Abram remembered the word of the Lord and did as Sarai suggested?
Good point. Why is there no accompanying statement from the Lord affirming Abram's obedience in that moment? Usually when patriarchs obey a tough command.
There's often some divine affirmation, yes. Plus, if God commanded it for the sake of the covenant, why did the outcome Ishmael ultimately have to be cast out from the covenant line later on?
Right, we'll get into that exclusion later, but the results of the action seem to complicate the idea that it was straightforward, righteous obedience to a divine command needed for the covenant.
It raises serious questions about that interpretation.
This brings us to the footnotes. You mentioned fact-checking.
Yes, this is where we really encourage you, the listener, to be the ultimate fact-checker.
Right.
When a bold foundational claim is made, like a direct divine command for Abraham's polygamy, the very first place you should look for scriptural verification is the footnotes provided in the text itself.
They're supposed to support the claim, right?
They are intended to provide the scriptural basis. Yet in the case of D&C 132.34, the footnotes, ironically, seem to expose the very weakness of the claim being made in the main text.
Okay, let's zero in on that. Footnote A, attached to the word commanded in D&C 132.34. What's the first reference listed?
The very first reference is Genesis 16.
Genesis 16.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as we've just spent time establishing, Genesis 16 is the chapter that pretty clearly proves Sarai initiated the marriage.
So the footnote points you to the evidence that contradicts the verse it's footnoting.
It seems that way. The irony is just quite astonishing. The primary source text cited to support the divine command, I, the Lord, commanded it, is the exact text that contains the phrase, Sarai said unto Abram, and Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai.
It's almost like the compilers felt obligated to include the reference because, well, that's the only place the event is actually described in the Bible.
Plausibly. But in doing so, they inadvertently provided the very evidence that highlights the textual contradiction.
Wow. Okay. Now, if you are an apologist trying to defend the DNC 132 claim using Genesis 16,
Yeah.
how would you approach it?
You'd likely lean heavily on a legalistic reading. You might argue that Sarai's action, while initiated by her, was permissible under the broader covenant framework and the cultural laws of the time. Therefore, it was implicitly sanctioned by God.
So God didn't stop it, therefore he implicitly approved it, which justifies DNC 132 saying he commanded it later.
Something along those lines. That God worked through Sarai's initiative, perhaps. But that kind of justification completely ignores the emotional context, the narrative flow, the lack of any explicit divine command initiating the action in Genesis. It sidesteps the plain reading.
Okay, that covers the first footnote reference.
Yep.
But footnote A offers two others. Let's look at the second one, Galatians 4. Why on earth would a New Testament letter from Paul be cited here?
This one is, frankly, utterly baffling if your goal is to defend Abraham's polygamy as a positive covenantal act.
Why? What does Paul do in Galatians 4?
The Apostle Paul uses the entire narrative, Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Isaac, Ishmael, as an extended allegory. And the purpose of his allegory is specifically to exclude Hagar and Ishmael from the covenant of grace and promise.
He uses them as negative examples.
Essentially, yes. Walk us through Paul's argument there, because this context is absolutely essential for understanding why citing Galatians 4 here is so destructive to the polygamy claim.
Okay, Paul uses the two women, Hagar and Sarah, to represent two distinct covenants.
Right. Hagar, the slave woman, the bondwoman as he calls her, represents the old covenant of the law, given at Mount Sinai, associated with earthly Jerusalem bondage.
And Sarah?
Sarah, the free woman, represents the new spiritual covenant of promise and grace associated with the heavenly Jerusalem freedom in Christ. Paul's entire point is that the true covenant inheritance comes through faith, symbolized by Isaac's miraculous birth to the free woman.
Not through human works or legal arrangements.
Exactly. Not through the flesh, symbolized by Ishmael's birth to the bondwoman, which came about through human planning and, well, Hagar's bondage.
And doesn't Paul explicitly quote Sarah's demand from Genesis?
He does. He quotes Genesis 21.n directly. Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman.
Wow. So Paul uses the very act of expelling Hagar and Ishmael as the scriptural proof for his theological point about who belongs to the covenant of promise.
Precisely. That quote is the climax of Paul's analogy. He's defining the necessary separation between the legalistic attempt to fulfill the covenant, Hagar's son, initiated by Sarai, and the miraculous fulfillment through God's power, Isaac, born to Sarah.
So Galatians 4 doesn't affirm plural marriage as some eternal principle God commanded Abraham to start.
Quite the opposite. It uses the product of that specific plural marriage, Ishmael, as the very symbol of exclusion from the eternal inheritance. It fundamentally destroys the idea that Abraham's relationship with Hagar was a necessary God-commanded step in establishing the eternal covenant line. Citing Galatians 4 here is like citing evidence against your own case.
So the first external scriptural reference, Genesis 16, contradicts the claim of divine command, and the second one, Galatians 4, refutes the idea that the result of that union was part of the core covenant.
That's what a straightforward reading suggests, yes.
Okay, what is the third reference in that footnote?
The third reference listed in footnote A for DNC 132.34 is DNC 132.65.
Wait, what references itself?
Yes. It uses another verse within the same section of the Doctrine and Covenants to prove the claim made in verse 34.
That seems like circular reasoning, using the revelation to prove the revelation. An authority loop.
That's exactly what it looks like. It's using itself as its own authority. There's no independent external validation being offered in that third reference.
What does that reliance on internal referencing suggest to you?
Well, it strongly suggests that the compilers, when they put these footnotes together, likely couldn't find any clear, unambiguous external scripture, either Old or New Testament, that explicitly states God commanded Abraham to marry Hagar.
So their inability to locate a verifiable external command forced them into this kind of internal and, as we've seen, somewhat contradictory referencing.
That appears to be the situation reflected in the footnotes themselves. The evidence cited doesn't seem to support the claim being made in verse 34.
Okay, so if we synthesize this first section, the textual evidence strongly suggests that the divine commandment for Abraham's polygamy asserted in D&C 132 is, at best, uncorroborated by the biblical record, and at worst, directly contradicted by it.
And the footnotes provided seem to underscore, rather than resolve, this lack of foundational support.
Which points toward the practice, in this specific foundational case, stemming more from human culture, desperation, and agency.
Rather than a clear, undisputed divine decree initiating it.
Okay, that textual instability is clear, but that just leads us right into the next major issue raised by the analysis, the ethical instability.
Right. Section 2, Hagar, slavery, and the ethical problem.
We have to address the reality here. The source material we're looking at is quite blunt in its analysis, isn't it?
It is. It argues that the relationship between Abraham and Hagar wasn't just polygamy, it was rooted in practices we would now call sex slavery and coercion.
And that reality instantly makes it incredibly problematic to use as a foundation for any kind of claimed righteous institution, especially an eternal one.
This is the historical and cultural context that absolutely must be faced head-on. We cannot sanitize Hagar's status. The text is clear. She was an Egyptian slave, a handmaid.
What did that mean, practically speaking, back then?
In the legal terms of the 19th century BCE, it meant she was chattel, property. She belonged to Sarai.
Let's briefly trace how she likely came into their possession. The source points back to Genesis 12, doesn't it?
Yes, verses 14 through 19. That incident in Egypt where Sarai was briefly taken into Pharaoh's house because Abram said she was his sister.
Pharaoh gave Abram gifts?
Yes, compensating Abram for taking Sarai, thinking she was Abram's sister, available for marriage. Pharaoh gave him vast wealth, sheep, oxen, camels, donkeys, and significantly, male and female servants.
Yeah, and Hagar was likely one of those female servants.
Almost certainly. She was part of that transactional wealth Abram acquired in Egypt, a possession obtained through that ethically dubious situation.
And Sarai reinforces this status later, doesn't she?
Absolutely. When Sarai gives Hagar to Abram, she explicitly calls Hagar my maid, ownership language.
And then later, when conflict arises between the women after Hagar conceives.
When Hagar maybe shows some contempt for the barren Sarai and Sarai complains to Abram, what does Abram say? He doesn't treat Hagar as an equal wife. He responds by reaffirming Sarai's ownership. Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee.
Thy maid is in thy hand. That's stark language.
It's the language of property rights, plain and simple. Hagar was Sarai's property, and Abram basically says, she's yours, do what you want with her. He doesn't protect her as a wife. This underlines her status wasn't really wife, but slave used for breeding.
Which brings us to the very nature of the relationship itself. Hagar wasn't taken as a wife for companionship or love, was she?
No. The stated purpose, Sarai's purpose, was purely functional, purely reproductive. It may be that I may obtain children by her.
She was essentially a tool.
A reproductive tool. Hagar functioned as a surrogate mother, or as the source puts it, a surrogate womb. Her value to Abram and Sarai in this context was entirely based on her reproductive capacity.
And this is where the analysis gets really pointed.
Yes. The source states plainly that Abraham's polygamy, in this specific instance with Hagar, involved sex slavery.
Why that term?
Because Hagar was a slave, her body, her womb, and the child produced by her womb were legally considered the property of her owners Sarai and Abram. They were not her own to command or control.
She had no choice in the matter.
Exactly. She did not have the freedom to consent or refuse. That lack of agency is the core of the coercion argument.
Now, I can hear a counter-argument forming here. Some apologists might argue that Hagar, as a handmaid given to the husband specifically to bear children, might have held the status of a concubine.
Yes, that distinction is often raised.
And isn't a concubine typically seen as having a status slightly higher than a mere slave, maybe granting her certain customary rights or protections? How does the analysis deal with that possibility?
That's an excellent point, and it requires careful parsing of the terms and the text. Well, the term concubine in some ancient contexts could imply a sort of secondary permanent wife with specific, albeit lesser, rights. Hagar's fundamental status in the Genesis narrative seems consistently derived from her being a bondwoman.
A slave, first and foremost.
Yes. Remember later, when Sarah demands her expulsion after Isaac is born, she doesn't say, cast out the concubine. She says, cast out this bondwoman and her son, Genesis 21.0. That reinforces her chattel status right at the critical moment of exclusion. The text never seems to grant Hagar the full rights or standing of even a secondary protected wife within the covenant household itself.
So she seems to occupy the most vulnerable position possible.
Mhm.
A slave owned by another woman who is then forced into sexual and reproductive service for her owners.
Precisely. And she had no legal or social power to refuse and negotiate the terms. The core problem, highlighted again and again in this analysis, is that this specific foundational instance of plural marriage began with a complete and utter lack of agency and choice for the woman involved.
This is why the source connects it to the concept found in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Right.
Exactly. That comparison, while perhaps jarring, is powerful because it forces the listener, forces you, to confront the raw reproductive exploitation at the heart of the specific relationship. It strips away the centuries of theological justification and asks you to look at the power dynamics described in the text itself.
Okay, so if we take that historical reality, that ethical assessment of Hagar's situation, and connect it to modern standards and ethics.
The problem becomes immediate and profound. Modern faith communities, including the mainstream LDS Church today, universally condemn sexual coercion and the violation of agency. Consent is paramount.
So how can a practice whose scriptural origin story, the very first example given, is so deeply entangled with the complete subjugation of a woman's agency with slavery and forced conception be presented as the foundation of an eternal righteous law?
That's the ethical chasm that needs to be bridged. How do you reconcile that? How can a practice rooted fundamentally in the lack of human choice be the vehicle for achieving eternal glory, a state where agency is supposedly the cornerstone principle?
It seems like if you claim D&C 132 restores an eternal law exemplified by Abraham and Hagar, you are, perhaps unintentionally, claiming that God commanded a practice whose biblical origin story involves coercion and property rights over human beings.
It certainly forces that difficult conversation. It demands reconciliation. Can the principle be separated from its problematic origin? Or does the origin taint the principle itself, suggesting it was a cultural adaptation rather than a divine mandate?
And the source material we're looking at draws a pretty tragic line from Abraham's use of Hagar, the slave concubine.
To the persistence of similar kinds of abuse in some modern contexts, particularly in certain polygamous splinter groups.
It specifically references groups like the Warren Jeffs FLDS.
Yes, citing situations where girls are reportedly manipulated, sometimes imprisoned or threatened with eternal damnation to force them into marriages, often with much older, powerful men.
It's a profound, though obviously non-denominational in the source's usage here, echo of those ancient power dynamics, isn't it?
The underlying dynamic feels tragically similar. A powerful figure, often male, claiming divine authority to override the consent, the bodily autonomy, and the future of a vulnerable individual, often female.
So if Abraham's foundational plural marriage involved the systemic denial of Hagar's choice and freedom,
then the horrific outcomes seen in modern groups practicing similar forms of coercion should perhaps give us pause before declaring the principle itself, as exemplified by that first instance, as inherently divine or eternally righteous. It suggests the potential for abuses baked into the power imbalance from the start.
this leads directly to that really challenging question the analysis poses to you, the listener. If Abraham's polygamy, which in Hagar's case was founded on property rights, slavery, and resulted in abandonment, is held up as the foundational example of an eternal law necessary for exaltation, are we then implying, even accidentally, that the principles of ancient slavery and, dare we say it, sex slavery, should also somehow be considered components of Zion or the celestial kingdom? Because they were part of that original package.
And of course, adherents today would vehemently deny that. They would say the principle of plural marriage can be practiced righteously without coercion.
But the argument here is about the foundation.
Exactly. If you accept the practice of polygyny based on the Abrahamic example, while simultaneously rejecting the cultural conditions of slavery and coercion that enabled that specific instance with Hagar, you are essentially admitting that the foundation itself was deeply flawed and culturally situated.
Not eternally mandated in that form.
It suggests, perhaps, that God tolerated a cultural corruption in Abraham's time, working within it, rather than actively instituting that specific coercive dynamic as a divine command for all time. It shifts the perspective significantly.
Okay, this issue of cultural tolerance versus divine command, it gets even more complex, doesn't it, when we look at other aspects of Abraham's life that are completely ignored by the later restoration narrative, focused solely on polygyny.
Absolutely. This brings us to section 3. Forgotten context, polyandry, and Abram's character.
Right. We need to quickly define some terms again, just for clarity, because these marriage structures can get confusing.
Good idea. So polygamy is the general umbrella term having multiple spouses.
Got it.
Polygyny, that's one man with multiple wives. This is what Mormon polygamy usually refers to and what D&C 132 focuses on.
Okay.
And polyandry, that's one woman with multiple husbands.
Polyandry. One woman, multiple husbands. Okay. With that definition in mind, let's revisit that often overlooked event from Genesis 12:1 toward 19. This happened before Abraham ever took Hagar. We touched on it briefly regarding Hagar's acquisition.
Right, the incident in Egypt. But let's look at Sarai's role here.
This is Sarai's potential polyandry.
The detail here is just fascinating because it establishes a precedent within Abraham and Sarai's own lives for multiple spouses existing concurrently, yet it's never brought up in the context of restoring eternal laws.
So what exactly happened in Genesis 12?
Abram and Sarai go to Egypt. Abram, fearing for his life because Sarai is beautiful, tells her, "Say you're my sister."
Which was a half-truth technically, but misleading.
Very misleading. Pharaoh sees Sarai, is impressed by her beauty, and the text states explicitly that Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's house.
Taken into his house. As what?
The implication and how Pharaoh treated Abram afterward with gifts strongly suggests she was taken to be Pharaoh's wife.
So, for a period of time, however brief it was, until God intervened with plagues on Pharaoh's household, forcing him to release her.
Yes.
Sarai was effectively married to two men simultaneously. Abram, her original husband, and Pharaoh, her new royal husband.
That's the situation described. It appears to be a clear case of, well, uncondemned biblical polyandry.
Uncondemned. God sends plagues, but does the text explicitly condemn Sarai for having two husbands?
No, the text doesn't direct condemnation at Sarai for the polyandrous situation itself. God's judgment falls on Pharaoh for taking another man's wife, even though Pharaoh didn't know the full truth initially. Sarai is portrayed more as a victim of circumstance and Abram's poor decision. But the fact remains, the situation existed.
Okay, so here's the irony the analysis points out.
It's incredibly rich, isn't it? Abram's later polygyny with Hagar and later Keturah, gets elevated in D&C 132 to the highest level and indispensable eternal law that must be restored for exaltation.
But Sarai's earlier polyandry, an event also embedded right there in the lives of the founding couple, the father and mother of the faithful.
It's completely ignored by the restoration doctrine. It was never restored, never taught as an eternal principle people needed to practice.
Why the selective restoration? If the guiding principle is that God commands and restores eternal laws found exemplified in the lives of the patriarchs and matriarchs.
Then why is one form of multiple marriage, polygyny, absolutely essential, while the other form, polyandry, experienced by the primary matriarch herself, completely dismissed as just a weird cultural anomaly or a mistake?
The inconsistency is jarring.
It strongly suggests that the selection of which practice to restore was driven less by consistent eternal principles found in Genesis and perhaps more by later theological needs or, frankly, the practical desires and patriarchal structure of the 19th century church leadership claiming the revelation.
Polygyny fits certain goals.
Polygyny provided a theological justification for accumulating wives, potentially increasing posterity quickly, and reinforcing a specific kind of male authority and hierarchy. It fit the developing patriarchal structure.
And polyandry.
Polyandry served none of those 19th century purposes. In fact, it would have fundamentally destabilized the very patriarchal hierarchy being established. Imagine the confusion if women could also claim multiple husbands based on Sarai's precedent.
So the silence around Sarai's polyandry is telling.
Extremely telling. It strongly implies that both forms of multiple marriage seen in Abraham and Sarai's lives were likely cultural deviations or accommodations that God permitted or worked through in that ancient context, rather than divine commands. But only one form, polygyny, was later singled out, elevated, and leveraged for doctrinal foundation.
Okay, that cultural context helps frame the next point about Abraham's character. He's often held up as this strong patriarch, the ultimate example of priesthood leadership.
Right, the model of righteous dominion.
Yet the analysis here suggests he was actually, in his key interactions with Sarai, profoundly humble and even submissive to his primary wife, which presents a pattern very different from the power dynamics often associated with later institutionalized polygamy.
That moment in Genesis 16.2 is key again. Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. He listened to her. The analysis draws a really powerful parallel here.
To Adam and Eve.
Yes, suggesting that just as Adam is sometimes seen as having righteously hearkened to Eve in the garden, in some interpretations, Abram was listening to his covenant wife. He was treating her as a partner, perhaps even a senior partner, in solving this major life crisis of barrenness, even if her proposed plan turned out to be deeply flawed and cause immense pain later.
And how does this contrast with historical polygamy?
Well, think about the historical accounts of polygamy, particularly in the early Utah period. They often involve significant power imbalances, where the husband's will is paramount and the wife's feelings or objections are often overruled, sometimes explicitly using priesthood authority.
There's that concept of unrighteous dominion from D&C 121.
Exactly. D&C 121 verses 39 and 40 strongly condemn that the tendency of men holding authority to abuse it, to coerce, to cover sins, gratify pride, or exercise control or compulsion upon others.
So, does Abraham exhibit that kind of behavior in the Hagar narrative?
According to this analysis, absolutely not. If we track his actions consistently, he continually submits to Sarai's will and desire regarding Hagar. He takes Hagar because Sarai tells him to. When Sarai mistreats Hagar and Hagar flees, Abram doesn't step in to protect Hagar as an equal. He tells Sarai effectively, she's your slave, handle it. He reaffirms Sarai's power over Hagar.
And later, when Isaac is born and Sarah demands Hagar and Ishmael be cast out.
Even though the text says it was very grievous to Abraham because he loved his son Ishmael, he still ultimately submits to Sarah's demand, especially after God tells him to listen to her.
So, rather than exercising the kind of unrighteous dominion that unfortunately plagued many historical polygamist households, Abraham seems to act consistently as a devoted, maybe even overly deferential husband. He places his covenant wife's counsel and desires first, even when it causes him immense personal grief.
That's the interpretation presented. The conclusion drawn is that Abraham was, at his core, unflinchingly faithful to his one covenant wife, Sarah. He never seems to actively seek out a second wife to increase his own power, glory, or status, which kind of contradicts the justification sometimes used later, where accumulating wives is seen as a measure of a man's eternal greatness or kingdom.
He wasn't a polygamist at heart.
That's the argument. He wasn't driven by a desire for multiple wives. He was a man navigating the complex, sometimes corrupt, legal and cultural landscape of his time, largely under pressure from his most trusted and covenant-bound partner, Sarai. He seems to be reacting, not initiating, when it comes to Hagar.
Okay, so Abraham's deference to Sarai and the resulting family tension leads us inevitably to that moment of separation, the covenant exclusion.
Section 4. The covenant exclusion.
This is the fourth major point in the analysis, and it seems to fundamentally undermine the whole idea that Abraham's plural marriage was somehow essential or required for God's eternal covenant plan with him.
Because the scriptural record is just absolute on this point, Hagar and her son Ishmael were eventually and definitively excluded from that primary covenant line.
When does this crisis finally come to a head?
It arrives quite some time later, well over a decade after Hagar conceived Ishmael. Sarai, who by now has been renamed Sarah by God, miraculously gives birth to Isaac, the long-awaited son of promise.
A miracle child.
The miracle child. And suddenly, the tension that must have been simmering between the two sons, Ishmael, the firstborn son of the slave, and Isaac, the son of the covenant wife, becomes completely untenable.
What's the specific trigger?
The breaking point is recorded in Genesis 21, verses 9 and 10. Sarah sees Ishmael, who would have been a teenager by then, mocking. The Hebrew word can imply playing, but often carries a sense of scorn or persecution.
And Sarah's reaction is immediate and fierce.
Absolutely fierce. She goes to Abraham and demands, "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac."
Wow. Shall not be heir. That's the voice of the covenant wife, explicitly asserting the primacy, the exclusivity of the singular promised line through Isaac.
It is, and the text makes it really clear that this demand was deeply painful for Abraham. Genesis 21.11 says, "And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son."
He loved Ishmael.
Of course. He had raised Ishmael as his only son, his heir apparent, for probably 13 or 14 years by this point. This wasn't just casting out a servant's child, it was casting out his firstborn son.
But then God intervenes. What does God say?
God steps in and confirms Sarah's demand. He places divine weight behind the exclusion. God tells Abraham essentially, "Don't be grieved about the boy or your slave. Listen to Sarah, specifically. Hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called."
God tells him to listen to Sarah and confirms the covenant line is only through Isaac.
Yes. It's a stunning moment of direct divine support for the exclusion of the plural wife or slave concubine and her son from the household and critically from the covenant inheritance.
So Abraham, despite his grief,
He submits. He obeys God and Sarah. He gets up early the next morning, gives Hagar some bread and a skin of water, and sends her and Ishmael out into the wilderness of Beersheba.
The source material emphasizes the severity of this act, right?
It does. It notes that this wasn't just sending them away with provisions, it was effectively abandoning them in the desert. They were left to die, and would have, without the Lord's direct, miraculous intervention providing water when theirs ran out.
So God supports the separation, affirming that the plural marriage situation with Hagar was ultimately a detour, maybe a mistake based on human planning.
Rather than the intended, divinely mandated destination for the covenant. The covenant path was clarified and narrowed back down to Isaac alone.
Okay, let's nail down the scriptural evidence showing the covenant runs solely through Isaac and Sarah. The analysis argues this repetition throughout Scripture is powerful evidence against the idea that polygamy was necessary for Abraham's exaltation or covenant fulfillment.
We can start even before Isaac was conceived. Back in Genesis 17, verse 21, when God is establishing the covenant of circumcision and renaming Abram and Sarai, he states unequivocally about the future son. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year.
Explicitly restricted to Isaac, Sarah's son.
Explicitly, no mention of Ishmael being included in that establishment of the covenant.
And we already discussed Paul in Galatians 4.
Right. Paul hammers this home allegorically centuries later, quoting Genesis 21, "Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman." For Paul, this isn't just history, it's defining theology about who inherits the promise through Christ.
Does the Book of Mormon weigh in on this lineage?
It certainly reinforces this foundational lineage. You have Isaiah 51.2, which is quoted directly in 2 Nephi 8.2, directing the house of Israel to remember their roots. Look unto Abraham your father and unto Sarah that bare you.
Abraham and Sarah. Again, Hagar is systematically excluded from this core covenant formula.
She is. And perhaps the most pervasive, constant scriptural repetition reinforcing this is that formulaic title for God himself.
The God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob.
Exactly. That specific phrase appears dozens and dozens of times throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Book of Mormon for Nephi 17.40 is just one example. It's the constant, unwavering descriptor of the covenant God and the covenant lineage he established.
And Ishmael is never included in that formula.
Never. It's always Abraham, Isaac, the son of promise, and Jacob, Isaac's son, renamed Israel. This relentless scriptural pattern establishes beyond much doubt that the covenant blessing, the birthright, was transmitted solely through the son of the covenant wife, Sarah.
So if polygamy, specifically the union with Hagar, were truly essential or necessary to kickstart the eternal seed as D&C 132 might imply,
You'd expect Ishmael to retain some form of covenantal connection or birthright status, but the scriptures repeatedly and emphatically deny this. He is excluded from that line.
it's really important to note, though, that God didn't just abandon Hagar and Ishmael completely, did he?
No, absolutely not. And the source analysis highlights this important detail. Hagar receives her own independent promise of posterity directly from an angel of the Lord back in Genesis 16, verse 10, when she first fled from Sarai. I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And later, God reaffirms, he will make a great nation of Ishmael too.
Okay, so what's the significance of Hagar getting her own promise?
It's beautiful, first, because it demonstrates God's compassion and providence for Hagar in her immense suffering. He sees her affliction. But theologically, it's crucial because that promise confirms that Ishmael's line and destiny were separate and independent from the specific covenant made through Isaac.
It shows God could fulfill promises of multiplication outside the main Abrahamic covenant line.
Exactly. It demonstrates that the plural marriage with Hagar was not required to fulfill the unique covenant promises given specifically through Isaac. God had other plans for Ishmael, great plans, but they were distinct.
This leads to the final and perhaps most stark confirmation of Ishmael's exclusion. The language God uses during the ultimate test of Abraham's life.
The binding of Isaac, Genesis 22. This is where the covenantal exclusion becomes absolute and undeniable in the text.
Also,
When God commands Abraham to offer the sacrifice, the language he uses deliberately, pointedly ignores Ishmael's very existence as a son in relation to the covenant. God says, "Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest." Genesis 22.2.
thine only son Isaac. Even though Ishmael was still alive, out there in the wilderness, presumably heading up his own growing family.
Yes, and this only son phrasing isn't a one-off slip. It's repeated multiple times in the chapter, Genesis 22.1 to 16.
Yeah.
And even D&C 10.1c uses the same language when referencing the event.
What is the profound significance of calling Isaac the only son, this covenantal erasure?
The significance is devastatingly clear. From the perspective of the covenant promise and inheritance, Ishmael, the product of the plural marriage conceived through human planning and the use of a slave woman, had been covenantally set aside, effectively disowned from that specific lineage.
Isaac alone was the heir.
Isaac alone was the son of the promise, the miracle child, the sole heir through whom the covenant would proceed. And this absolute exclusion is what sets the stage perfectly for the powerful New Testament and Book of Mormon analogy.
The sacrifice of Isaac is a type, a similitude.
The similitude of God the Father sacrificing his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. Jacob 4.5 in the Book of Mormon explicitly draws this parallel. If Ishmael still held any covenantal birthright status as a co-heir, the theological power and precision of that only son similitude would be severely diminished, wouldn't it?
It really would. It seems the scriptural record from Genesis to the Book of Mormon consistently emphasizes Sarah's line, Isaac's unique status, and by implication, the monogamous root of the covenant promise, demonstrating that the plural marriage with Hagar was a deviation from, and ultimately excluded from, the required path to that foundational covenant.
That's certainly the strong conclusion drawn from reading these texts together without trying to force them to fit the later claims of D&C 132.
Okay, this systematic exclusion, the prioritizing of Isaac as the only son, brings us to our final section. The whole concept of polygamy being framed as an Abrahamic test.
Section 5, polygamy as the flawed Abrahamic test.
Now, for many early adherents of Mormon polygamy, and even sometimes today, the practice was often justified or understood, especially by those who struggled with it, as an excruciating, heart-wrenching test of faith, right? Something akin to Abraham being asked to sacrifice Isaac.
Yes, that analogy was frequently invoked to give spiritual meaning to the immense personal suffering, particularly for the women involved.
But the source material we're examining argues that using this analogy is actually deeply flawed. Why?
Because the analysis suggests the analogy, when applied to 19th century polygamy, fundamentally inverts the roles of the sacrificer and the sacrificed and misses the crucial outcome of Abraham's actual test.
Before we get into the flaw, where does that term Abrahamic test or Abrahamic sacrifice even come from? Is it scriptural?
That's an important point. The analysis notes that those specific phrases, Abrahamic test or Abrahamic sacrifice, do not appear anywhere in the standard works. Not the Bible, Book of Mormon, D&C, or Pearl of Great Price.
Really, it feels so ingrained in Mormon cultural language.
It does. It appears to be a piece of cultural lexicon, a folk term, likely developed within Mormonism itself, perhaps originating in the Nauvoo or Utah periods, precisely to spiritualize the profound difficulty and personal cost of polygamy. It frames the suffering as a badge of extreme faithfulness, like Abraham's.
Okay, so it's a cultural term, not a scriptural one. Now, let's look closely at Abraham's actual test with Isaac in Genesis 22. What was the critical outcome of God's command to sacrifice his son?
Abraham demonstrated absolute willingness to obey. He journeyed 3 days, built the altar, bound Isaac, laid him on the wood, and raised the knife. His obedience was total up to that point.
Right.
But, and this is the crucial defining feature of the story, he did not go through with it. He was stopped.
By divine intervention.
Yes. The angel of the Lord called out, told him not to harm the boy because now God knew he feared him, seeing he hadn't withheld his only son, and then the substitute was provided the ram caught in the thicket.
And the theological meaning of that intervention is usually understood how?
As the source notes, it's profoundly Christological. The ram represents the Savior, Jesus Christ, the substitute sacrifice. Isaac represents humankind, saved from death by that substitution. The test was about Abraham's willingness to obey, demonstrated by his immediate action, but his ultimate commendation and the covenant blessing came because he stopped the sacrifice when commanded and accepted the divine substitute.
Okay, willingness demonstrated, but the sacrifice itself averted by God's mercy.
Precisely. Now contrast that with how the analogy was often used by early Mormon polygamists, particularly the men initiating plural marriages.
They claimed entering into plural marriage felt like an Abrahamic test for them.
Yes, many records indicate they described it that way, agonizing, requiring immense faith, like sacrificing their dearest feelings or even their wife's happiness. However, the historical record is clear. Unlike Abraham with Isaac, they actually carried out the sacrifice.
What do you mean they carried it out?
They didn't stop. Even when faced with their first wife's heartbreak, their own conscience potentially screaming against breaking the original monogamous covenant or the social upheaval it caused, they proceeded with the practice. They went through with adding more wives.
So the analogy fails right there. They claim to be like Abraham facing the test.
But they failed to act like Abraham at the crucial moment. They didn't wait for, or perhaps didn't receive, a divine command to stop. There was no ram in the thicket provided for the first wife's feelings. They completed the act that caused the pain.
The source material makes an even stronger, more provocative argument here, doesn't it? About who is really being sacrificed.
It does. It argues that in the context of early Mormon polygamy, it was often the wives, particularly the first wives, who were the ones truly being sacrificed, metaphorically speaking. They were placed on the altar of this new doctrine.
Like Isaac was meant to be.
Exactly. The men claimed the Abrahamic role, the difficulty of wielding the knife, but it was the women who often experienced the devastating blow, the sacrifice of their emotional security and expected relationship.
So the men claimed the test, but the women were often the victims of the completed sacrifice.
That's the powerful and, frankly, tragic argument presented. Let's define the nature of that sacrifice for the wives more clearly. What was actually being sacrificed from their perspective?
It wasn't physical life, obviously, but
It was the sacrifice of their autonomy in many cases, their emotional well-being, their sense of security and primacy in their marriage, their entire expectation of an exclusive, monogamous relationship, both in this life and potentially eternally.
there are many historical accounts from women expressing this, right?
Heartbreaking accounts. Women describing the introduction of plural marriage into their homes as feeling like death, like being stabbed to the heart, like having their world completely shattered. The men, by proceeding with the practice despite this impact, were in effect completing the sacrifice they were taking, the emotional and spiritual life, you might say, of their covenant wife's foundational marital identity.
And this is where the analogy completely collapses, according to the analysis.
Utterly. Because for the wives who were subjected to this completed sacrifice, who felt their hearts broken on that altar, there was no ram in the thicket.
No substitute provided?
No substitutionary relief provided for their specific emotional or spiritual suffering within the framework of the practice itself. There was, as the source puts it, no merciful command from God audible to them, telling their husbands to stay their hand and to not stab them to the heart.
The analogy is tragically inverted.
Completely inverted. The men claimed the mantle of Abraham, the faithful sacrificer willing to obey God's hardest command. But in carrying out the act that caused such pain, they arguably became the functional executioners of their wives' marital security, completing the sacrifice, unlike Abraham, who received divine commendation precisely because he stopped when told.
This fundamental discrepancy, this inversion, really undermines the legitimacy of using the Abrahamic test analogy to justify or spiritually elevate the practice of polygamy and the suffering it caused.
It certainly challenges that common justification profoundly. It asks us to reconsider who is truly being tested and who is paying the price.
Okay, so to bring this really comprehensive deep dive to a close, let's try to synthesize the ultimate message that seems to emerge from this critical reading of the sources on Abraham, Hagar, D&C 132, and the test analogy.
What's the final takeaway?
The final assessment presented in the analysis is quite compelling, and maybe quite different from traditional interpretations. It argues that the entire story of Abraham's plural marriage with Hagar, from its problematic inception, rooted in cultural desperation, barrenness, and the institution of slavery,
Through the jealousy and conflict it generated.
to its tragic resolution involving the painful expulsion and covenantal exclusion of Hagar and Ishmael.
The whole episode only seemed to cause heartache and division for everybody involved. Abraham grieved, Sarai was likely stressed and perhaps guilty, Hagar suffered immensely, Ishmael was cast out, Isaac grew up in the shadow of that conflict.
And the analysis notes that we arguably see the echoes of that division even today in the historical and ongoing contentions between the descendants of Ishmael, often associated with Arab peoples, and the descendants of Isaac, the Jewish people.
That ancient family split still resonates geopolitically.
So rather than being elevated as this shining example of righteous living or some indispensable eternal doctrine required for God's plan,
The analysis strongly suggests that the story of Abraham's polygamy with Hagar should perhaps be read primarily as what it appears to be on the surface, a cautionary tale.
a cautionary tale about what?
About the immense suffering and the long-term dangers that can arise from human interference in divine promises, trying to force God's hand through culturally accepted but ethically problematic means. And also a cautionary tale about the corruptions inherent in ancient cultures, whether those corruptions manifest as slavery or polyandry as seen with Sarai, or the specific instance of polygyny with Hagar.
That's a profound reframing, isn't it?
It really is. It shifts the narrative entirely. It moves Abraham's polygamy from being seen as an eternal mandate that was required for his exaltation and the covenant.
To potentially being understood as a temporary, painful, culturally bound aberration. A mistake, even. One that God permitted and worked through, yes, but ultimately resolved by firmly reaffirming the original monogamous covenant line through Isaac and Sarah alone.
It emphasizes the exclusion, not the practice itself, as the final word on the covenant line.
Okay, let's try to briefly synthesize our main takeaways for you, the listener, after covering all that ground.
First, the doctrinal justification for polygamy found in D&C 132, specifically citing Abraham's example as a command from God, appears textually unstable when compared directly with the historical account in Genesis 16, which attributes the idea to Sarai. The footnotes seem to confirm this instability.
Second, this justification largely ignores or minimizes the profound ethical problems inherent in the foundational Hagar story specifically, her status as a slave, the coercion involved, and her utter lack of agency in the matter. Using a relationship founded on these principles as a model for eternal righteousness is deeply problematic.
Third, the eventual outcome of Abraham's plural marriage with Hagar wasn't blessing and inclusion within the core covenant, but rather separation, conflict, expulsion, and definitive exclusion from the covenant line, which passed solely through Isaac, the son of the first wife, Sarah.
And finally, the common analogy of polygamy being an Abrahamic test is flawed because Abraham's test was about willingness but stopping the sacrifice, whereas the implementation of polygamy involved completing a sacrifice, often at the profound emotional expense of the wives, undermining the very point of the Isaac story.
We know we covered a lot of very dense and potentially challenging material today. We really encourage you to go back and revisit the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar in Genesis chapter 16 through 22, roughly, with some of these points of analysis in mind.
Read it for yourself. Ask yourself honestly, when you read those ancient scriptural texts on their own terms, can you actually find a clear, verifiable commandment from God initiating polygamy for Abraham? Or does that claim primarily rest on the later assertion made in D&C 132?
It's a crucial question to ponder for yourself.
And here is one final provocative thought for you to mull over as you conclude this deep dive, something that builds on that flawed analogy. If Abraham's greatest commendation, the very reason he is called the father of the faithful, was rooted in his ultimate willingness to not complete the sacrifice of his promised son-sparing Isaac, and accepting the divine substitute.
If his righteousness was sealed in stopping the sacrifice.
What does it then say about a doctrine that, in practice, often required its adherents, particularly the men, to complete a sacrifice, effectively sacrificing their wives' emotional security, autonomy, and hearts in order for those men to be considered fully righteous and obedient to that doctrine?
It's a stark contrast to consider.
It really is. Thank you for joining us for this rigorous deep dive into Doctrine and Covenants 132 and the foundational story of Abraham's polygamy.
We hope this exploration was helpful, and we look forward to exploring the next stack of sources with you next time on the Deep Dive.